I wouldn't dream of starting a freehand ink drawing without first doing the thing I'm about to show you. I started doing this consistently about 6 months ago, and it has so improved my drawings that it's become an essential part of my drawing process. It's a 3 to 5 minute investment in my mind and in my experience, a much better drawing. So what is it? Let me show you with the video and the drawing I did today. This was my reference photo, and this is the thing I drew. What I'm talking about is what I think of as a quick sketch of preparatory marks before I start my actual drawing. I'm not talking about a thumbnail. A thumbnail is a small version where we put all the elements of our drawing and we work out composition and usually values as well, where the lights and darks are going to be. But I'm not talking about that. But by making these preparatory marks, and I'll explain in more detail exactly what I do and don't include in them, we start the creative thinking process, which is so key to any creative activity and certainly drawing. And certainly when we draw directly in ink and we have no second chance with every mark we make. But besides warming up my thinking processes, it also warms up my hand-eye coordination. I start the process of seeing something and then making marks to indicate it. I get used to the feel of the pen on the paper. It lets me check my pen size to see whether it's a size that lets me draw the sort of detail I need at the sort of size I'm going to draw. And so I always do my preparatory marks, actual size of my drawing, not of my reference. Or if I'm wondering whether I want to use several different sizes of pen for different parts of my scene, I can experiment just at those transition points and see if it creates the effect I'm wanting. Sometimes the very first lines I make when I pick up a pen to start drawing can be a bit tentative, a bit uncertain, weakly drawn compared to the last lines I draw, which can have greater boldness and confidence. Well, by doing this, hopefully all of those hesitant, tentative, weak lines are on this scrap of paper and not on my finished drawing. And sometimes, particularly as in this example, if there's a particularly tricky part of the drawing that I'm wondering either how I'll draw it or how it's going to look, such as these banded fluted columns, then it gives me a chance just to practice that one detail. And then as soon as I've done this, and then as soon as I've done this, I can draw my actual drawing, utilizing both the general warming up I get, but also the specific information I've got from making these quick preparatory marks. I want to quickly look at a dozen drawings and their preparatory drawings, and I want to highlight how I used each particular example in a particular way to improve the drawing that I did. For this subject, I particularly wanted to work out the starting point. It wasn't as obvious for me with this view and these objects as it normally is. And so I was wanting to experiment with starting in this corner from this shape, using that shape for the scale. And so that gave me confidence that, yes, once I'd drawn this amount, I felt it was going to flow quite nicely from this point. The other thing I wasn't sure about was how I was going to draw the brickwork with this scale. I wanted to suggest that these weren't smooth walls, and yet the stones are relatively small from the distance we're looking at them from. And this told me that my approach for that was going to be okay, but I better take a little more care with my perspective angles of the rows of brickwork. For this subject of a small occasional table, it was just a very specific part I wanted to work out. And that was the ellipse at the top, the round seat, and the start of the legs, the positioning of them. I felt that if I got this correct, that the rest of it wouldn't be a problem. And so I drew this, particularly working on the ellipses and also on straightening out the slight warping of the oak top. This took me about 90 seconds and then let me confidently embark on the rest of the drawing. Building confidence before those first actual lines on our, if you like, art piece of paper is, I think, an important benefit of doing this. In this subject, the thing that I was most concerned about was this section with these rounded sections in the construction of this rounded tower and the steep angle of this wall and just how it all fit together, because this is not a perfectly round tower, but it's a rounded tower. And in fact, in my preparatory marks, what I learned was that my natural inclination was not going to be to take this as high as it needed to go. And the problem that was going to cause was that these lines wouldn't connect with the wall in the right place. And that I had to make sure I had this perspective angle correct if I was going to get this top line to curve around and connect in the right place. And so, having explored where the marks needed to be, it actually was much easier to keep this section under a tighter control. This is a local structure that I'm very familiar with in lots of ways, but not in terms of what marks are best used to capture in a very rapid sketch the texture effect of these flat stones that have been used to construct it. And so in 2 minutes, I did a very rough capture of the sorts of marks I was thinking of using to get the effect and the play of light and dark and shadow and form, and also size and scale, how close together these lines, these marks would have to be in order to create a sense of a structure made from stones this size. It let me explore silhouette edge as well. And so in no more than 2 minutes of these quick preparatory marks, I could then start my actual drawing with confidence, knowing that in really just a few further minutes than what I had allowed for there, I could capture a rapid but effective sense of the structure. This is a great way of exploring the texture effect that we're wanting to capture in certain parts of our subject. In this subject, it wasn't the texture, but it was trying to understand the form correctly, trying to understand the curvature and the effect that had on the pattern, particularly that we had in the back and in the sides. And so my preparatory sketch took just a little more time, but it was certainly more comprehensive in terms of the actual subject, because I was wanting to get a sense of the way the curves affected what was happening. And if there were going to be any problems in my drawing, I wanted to get an indication through doing this. And so, for instance, I realized that my first take had narrowed the back just a little bit too much, and there wasn't really room to fit all of these decorative elements in. I would have to curve the sides out or splay the sides out more, particularly on this side, if I were going to get all of this decoration in. And so this meant that when I came to start the actual drawing, I had a much stronger sense, firstly, of the overall shape and the curves in this chair. And I was also forewarned about just having to be extra vigilant about pushing enough width in the back of my chair, and then also keeping the decorative elements within the back of that chair in the right scale. For this subject, my preparatory marks time was really spent just exploring the shapes that I would be stacking on top of each other to get a sense of exactly how they stacked and how easily I could get them to look as if they were aligned in a straight line. It also let me explore how I was going to draw this shape here, which went from concave to convex. And I decided that this was a suitable way to do it with just a little more effort. It also let me look at my first take on the proportions of these various stages of the spire. And so with this 2-minute investment, it let me capture in my drawing a far greater degree of accuracy. And it meant I started my line work with just that more confidence and fluidity. This stage also let me just have that extra few moments of observation before I'm drawing my original drawing that let me focus on things such as by the time we get to the top of the spire, we're looking up underneath the cornices and the edges more. And there's foreshortening that's increasing as we go up. With this view of the Sydney Opera House, before I started my actual drawing, I wanted to use my time with my preparatory marks to get a sense of all these different shapes that we have defined by the curvature of the shells, and particularly the fullness of the curves and their alignment with each other horizontally and their various proportions to each other. And so my preparatory marks sketch let me do that. And I saw that when I did it, I didn't take this curve around over in a full enough way. I brought this to a point instead of much further along. And it also showed me here, when I had a good look at why it wasn't looking quite right, that these lines didn't come out far enough. And with all that information, when I did my actual drawing, I was able to get a far more accurate rendering of the shells from this viewpoint. With some subjects, there's just a lot of things that we feel we need to check before we commit to those final ink lines on our drawing. And with this caryatid from the front of the Musée du Louvre in Paris, I really wanted to just get a sense of how I was going to render the face at this scale, at this size, and exactly which of these gathers of fabric and folds and shadow I was going to use most to capture the effect of this figure without trying to draw an actual person's figure. I played around with several versions of the face. In fact, this was my first starting point, and then I wasn't happy with that face, and so I experimented with another face that I then progressed further than this one. And then I tried a few other options as well for various parts of the face, even just the mouth several times down here. This let me get a sense of proportion, where I might naturally be inclined to get things wrong. It alerted me to pay particular attention with the shoulders, and also helped me decide the composition, that in fact I was going to put this section of stacked entablature on the head as well as this stand, and that I would in fact draw this squared section of base as well. I certainly, I think, was more confidently able to do a better rendering of this in what was still a very quick drawing. Sometimes our preparatory marks sketch ends up being not so much exploring one or two or even various elements of the scene, as much as a full dress rehearsal. And this is particularly the case, I think, when we have a subject with which we're not overly familiar. And so when I was doing this local magpie, as I began to just sketch to get a sense of the form, I found that I was creating ambiguities in my head as I was making these lines and trying to define the planes, that I felt I needed to refine further to get a sense of exactly how the outer form of this bird was rounding or moving in a different direction, where the planes were meeting and at what angle they were meeting, as well as things such as the placement of the beak and the tail feathers and the legs, and even how to explore this shadow under the bird. And so this quick drawing probably didn't take much less time than I spent on the actual drawing. But it meant I could draw the actual drawing with a lot more confidence and boldness in my marks, because many of the questions I needed to ask and find answers for, I was able to do that in maybe the 6 minutes here, and then draw in 8 or 10 minutes here. But at other times, it's the exact opposite, Rather than a subject with which we're really unfamiliar, we get a subject that generally we're very comfortable with, very familiar with. And in that case, there may not be that much that really we need to do. But even then, it can be helpful just to have a little bit of a play around. And in this scene, the one thing that I was not overly familiar with was exactly how, in this case, I was going to represent the shadow of this telegraph pole. What direction will my lines go? And how exactly will I represent the fact that coming into the shadow are clumps of grass that are catching the light? So I used just a minute or two of my preparatory marks time to explore how I was going to do that. I also did a rough take on how I was going to draw the shadow around the wattle branches here. So sometimes exactly what we need to draw does depend with how familiar we are with the subject, which in the end may be something we can be fairly confident about from the first line we put on the paper. And of course, this method, this strategy for more accurate drawings is not foolproof. I knew that I was going to start with this center section to establish my scale and the width of the spire, and then use it to align up and downwards. So I worked at starting at the point I was going to start at, this column, and then moving across in each direction. And I looked at this and I thought, yep, that's an okay starting point. What I didn't notice in this drawing was how that here in the actual reference, from this point, if we come straight out, there is a gap between there and there. But in mine, in fact, there is no gap. In other words, I've drawn this section too high, way too high. This drop is all about capturing the perspective of the way these forms are being viewed. Not having noticed this in my preparatory marks doesn't mean I'm going to make the same mistake necessarily in my drawing. But in this case, it did. In fact, if anything, I made the mistake worse. Instead of this point sitting well below that point, this point actually sits higher than this point. And it has the effect of twisting this section more around towards us, but in a way that's in tension with the direction that the part underneath and above are moving. And of course, once I'd seen that, I thought it was too fundamental a problem for me to be satisfied with the drawing. So in fact, this 60-minute drawing became then a preparatory drawing for the final drawing, where I was able to correct the mistakes that I made here and make sure I particularly aligned this section correctly and this section correctly, and create a colonnaded section which sat comfortably into the same perspective patterning of the rest of the spire. So it's not an automatic system. We have to use the system and we have to make it work through careful observation. And if we do this, there's one final thing that we really have to be prepared for. And I experienced that in my drawing of this rose. A relatively simple subject where my preparatory marks started with the actual central part of the rose, but where really in just 2 or 3 minutes, the whole rose just fell into place so easily, so beautifully, so confidently, all to scale, doing everything pretty much I was wanting my drawing that I was about to do to capture. So having drawn, to my mind, a really nice lyrical rendition of the rose, I did my more considered, though still very brisk sketch of the rose. I managed not to position it well on the page so that I didn't actually have room on my paper to get these connections and to get these leaves, which I really wanted to do. And when I'd finished, as much as I was happy enough with the representation of the rose here, I couldn't help but feel that there was more life in my line work and overall drawing in the quick exploration of the sorts of marks and lines and proportions and positioning I was going to make in this first quick mark making preparatory exercise. And I find that these marks, the things in literally 90 seconds to maybe 3 or 4 minutes that I'm able to discover, have vastly improved the confidence and the accuracy of my first marks on the paper with my actual drawing. I do this every single drawing without a moment's thought now, and I think it has vastly improved my drawings. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Well, you know one more of my secrets now. Good drawing doesn't happen because someone's born talented or they're lucky or it's just easier for them somehow. It comes through hard work. It comes through study and observation and practice and experimentation. It comes from doing things and not being afraid of them not turning out as part of the learning process. So if you don't do this, can I really recommend that you give it a go? It is just a 2, 3, 4 minute investment of time. And if you have half the benefit I feel I've received from doing it, then I don't think anyone will ever have to encourage you to do it again. But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, with or without a quick preparatory mark making exploratory exercise, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.